The Millennium, a prophetic forecast by Johanna Brandt. Chapter 6. The Second Period, continued. Helena. Constantine the Great was married twice, but it is not with his wives with whom we propose to concern ourselves in this chapter, but with Helena, his mother, the real Empress of the day. We have seen at the opening of the previous chapter that Constantine's father, Valerius Constantius, was a young military officer in the Roman army before he was exalted to the rank of Caesar. It was during this part of his career that he married a young maiden of inferior station. Some historians say a female tavern keeper, but of extraordinary charm and virtue, Flavia Helena. The only child born of this love marriage was Constantine. When Constantius became Caesar, he found it necessary for state reasons to put Helena away from him and to form an alliance with Maximiana Theodora, the stepdaughter of the powerful ruler of the West, the Emperor Maximianus, in 292 AD. Helena then retired into obscurity, and Constantius's ascension to power was, as we have seen, cut short by his sudden death, upon which his son Constantine was made Caesar of the West. Constantine never forgot the slight put upon the mother whom he loved and reverenced with an abiding devotion. As soon as he was proclaimed emperor in 306 AD, he brought her to his court and heaped honors upon her. Her birthplace, Dreponium, in the Gulf of Nicomedia, was henceforth known as Helenopolis. Coins were struck with her image. Statues of her rose in every part of the land, and all the wealth and treasure of the empire was laid at her feet. There was practically no limit to her power. The fact that she was a daughter of the people was another valuable asset in her favor, and she made the most of it. She understood the people. She was one of them, and she saw to it that the splendor of her position did not form a barrier between them and herself. After Constantine, she was the most powerful personage in the empire, and like him, she used her power for good only. It is not certain at what time in her life she embraced the Christian faith, but we know that during Constantine's rule, she was a most ardent and devout follower of the Christ. Innumerable churches were erected by her. She also founded monasteries and endowed hospitals and other charitable institutions with fabulous sums of money. All her spare time was spent in visiting the poor and sick, and in devising means and ways for their alleviation. Helena was, in short, the beloved idol of her people, at whose magic touch the ills of life vanished. She was the emperor's right hand in affairs of the state, and supported him in his high policy of mediator between the hostile elements of the empire and of protector of the persecuted Christians. Small wonder then that the Roman Empire flourished and prospered at this time under the beneficent influence of these two remarkable people, as it had never done before. Small wonder that this period is marked by an exalted idealism, which acted as a leavening power in the whole world. But by far, the most important progress was made in the church. Its treasure houses overflowed with the wealth, which poured into them from every side, while its bishops became mighty lords of influence and authority. Gradually, the number of pagan worshippers decreased. The pagan temples were deserted and left empty, while the Christian churches filled with worshippers. there was never any formal rupture with heathendom. It was simply left to die out naturally, until finally the Church of Christ was established, firmly and irrevocably established, as the Church of the State. Incredibly, great as these achievements were, the activities of Helena and Constantine were not confined to the West alone. Helena was getting on in years, and she was able to look back on a long stretch of useful life, in which no human ambition had been frustrated. But there was one wish of her heart still unfulfilled. She longed most ardently to visit the Holy Land before she died, and worship on Palestine's sacred soil. It was a long and difficult enterprise in those days, but neither Constantine nor his mother were to be deterred from their purpose. Once they had made up their minds, and their expedition set out in the year 324 AD. In this small book, it is impossible to go into all the fascinating details of this pilgrimage. In fact, we have only introduced it because it was crowned with such far-reaching results and vast consequences in the history of the world, and because it bears directly on our subject of divine revelation. It seems that Constantine had inherited his gift for seeing sights and dreaming dreams from his devout and highly romantic mother. For this journey, which they undertook together, was marked by a series of mystic visions, in which startling revelations were made to them both. We cannot possibly bring conclusive proof that such revelations were made, but we know that they are quoted by most historians, and further, we have the most indisputable guarantee of their supposed existence in the fact that both Constantine and Helena were firmly convinced that they had taken place, and that they were of divine origin and infallibility. In how far this remarkable pair of mystics was influenced by imagination and by a too fervent desire to worship beside the Holy Sepulchre and the actual spot on which the crucifixion had taken place, on Golgotha, we cannot say. We positively refuse to enter into any argument on this prickly question, and we propose to confine ourselves to the far less dangerous subject of the well-established results of these mystic revelations, satisfying ourselves with the assurance that Constantine and Helena were not tortured by doubt or uncertainty at any time. When, after a long and eventful journey, they arrived at Jerusalem, they immediately instituted researches as to the lost sites and sacred relics, and found to their consternation and disappointment that the place where the Lord had lain was buried under an accumulation of rubbish of the past 3 centuries. Whether this was done deliberately by desecrating hands, or was the natural result of being so close to the city walls, we do not know. It was at this time that Constantine declared to have had the Holy Sepulchre revealed to him in a vision, and he pointed out the exact spot where a platform had been built over the piles of rubbish and a temple erected on the platform for the worship of the heathen goddess Venus. With characteristic energy and determination, Constantine set laborers to work to break down the temple and platform and to clear away the rubbish. It was a long and tedious task, but great was the joy of Constantine and his mother when a sepulchre was actually discovered on the very spot indicated in the vision. A sepulchre. We do not say the sepulchre. Whatever our private opinions on the subject may be. A sepulchre was found, and Constantine proceeded to mark it in a way that would establish it forever in the history of the world. His builders broke away the rocks surrounding the cave, until the ground sloped away in all directions, giving the sepulchre the appearance of an elevated monument. Great topographical changes were produced by these means, and the surroundings assumed a picturesque appearance of a rocky disorder. Vast building operations, extending over a period of 10 years, 326 to 336 AD, were then begun, under the most famous architects and builders of the world. The interior of the tomb was large enough to hold 9 men standing. The roof could be touched by raising the hand. To the right of the entrance and on the north side, the actual grave was elevated 3 spans above the floor and trough-like in appearance. This, as the central point of interest, Constantine adorned with beautiful and costly pillars. A round structure was arranged about the grave, with a circular hall, the upper part of which was open to the sky. One circle of pillars of extraordinary beauty and magnificence enclosed the other. The basilica stretched in a broad middle aisle and 2 smaller side aisles, eastward from the rotunda, about 245 feet in length. The elevated choir, with the altar and bishop's throne, and 12 beautiful pillars closed the aisle to the east. The place of the crucifixion was given as in the southern aisle, west of the choir. Constantine's builders treated this in like manner as they did the grave, breaking away the solid rock all round, so that a high hexagonal platform raised itself above the surrounding level. So we read in one of the historical descriptions. But the best work of Eusebius, dealing exclusively with this subject, has, alas, been lost, and the descriptions have been taken from the works of Rufinus, Socrates, Solomon, and Theoret, and from fragments let fall by Eusebius on various occasions in other works. To the east of the tomb, like a huge millstone, lay the stone which had been rolled before the mouth of the sepulchre. Helena's church was built on the Mount of Olives, and other stately structures rose wherever sacred sites were to be found in Bethlehem and in the Garden of Gethsemane. The consecration of these vastly impressive buildings took place 10 years after they were begun, in 336 AD, and they were visited by countless millions of pilgrims from every part of the world, until nearly 300 years later, they were entirely destroyed by fire under the Persian king Chosroes II in 614 AD. Before we leave the story of the Holy Sepulchre, let us see what strange vicissitudes befell it during the next 1400 years. King Chosroes II left a scene of desolation behind when he returned to Persia, bearing away with him many priceless relics of the sacred past, and the work of restoration was begun 2 years later, in 616 AD, by Modestus, abbot of the monastery of Theodosius, and completed 10 years later, in 626 AD. These magnificent buildings were burnt by the Arabs in the 10th century, who built a gorgeous mosque over Constantine's atrium to commemorate the fact that Omar had prayed there. In 1048, the Byzantine emperor raised new structures on a large scale, which were entered by the Crusaders in 1099. For nearly 30 years, the Crusaders worked at the most extensive improvements and additions in churches and aisles in the French style, which were likewise destroyed by fire in 1244. As late as 1808, the last great destruction took place, and the dome standing there at the present day was erected under the joint auspices of France and Russia in 1868. Many nations fought at different periods for the possession of the sacred spot. Rivers of blood flowed over the hallowed ground, in which the body of the Christ had lain, and of the order of the Franciscans alone, who were placed there as protectors of the Holy Sepulchre. Over 2,000 lives were sacrificed. The Holy Cross. The Empress Helena is said to have discovered the Holy Cross by means of divine revelation, and because the subject bears directly on the events to be described in chapter 8, it finds a place in this book. Indirectly, it was largely responsible for the Crusades 600 years later, for as the pilgrims poured into Palestine to admire Constantine's buildings, so they came from far and near to see and touch the cross discovered by Helena, and supposed to be the cross of Christ. It seems that in a vision the spot was revealed to her on Golgotha, where the cross lay buried. With the aid of two powerful mystics, Bishop Macarius and a Jew, whose name is unknown to us, she instituted researches, with the result that 3 buried crosses were found on Golgotha. The true one was recognized by means of Pilate's inscription in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. This is the King of the Jews, which was still attached to it, and by virtue of the miracle of healing which it possessed. Helena had these brought to Jerusalem and placed in safety for public exhibition to Christian pilgrims and other travelers. This gave rise to the institution of a religious ceremony or feast in grateful commemoration of the discovery on September 14th, which was called the Finding of the Cross. It was first naturalized in Constantinople, from where it spread throughout the entire church in the east, and in Syria and Egypt. The way was paved for it on every side by the magic story of Helena's life and influence, and by the migration of alleged fragments of the cross. In connection with this, it is interesting to note that more loads of fragments and splinters and nails from the Holy Cross were carried out of Palestine to every part of the world than the cross could possibly be broken into or contain. However, a cross was venerated as the true one in Jerusalem, until the Persian king Charles II carried it off in 614 AD, when he destroyed Constantine's buildings. The recovery of this cross in 638 AD by the Emperor Heraclius, who brought it back to Jerusalem and had it carried through the streets in a solemn and magnificent procession headed by himself, gave a new impulse to the festival of the Finding of the Cross, which was still celebrated many centuries after the final disappearance of the cross discovered by Helena. The reader must bear in mind that these stories are merely introduced because of the great complications which arose through them in the Christian Church. Even those of us who accept the story of Constantine's discovery of the Holy Sepulchre hesitate, with perfectly legitimate incredulity, to accept Helena's cross as the true one, for the simple reason that it is doubtful whether wood which had lain buried for over 300 years, would still be recognizable as wood at the end of that time. What she actually did find as a result of her mystic vision, we do not know. We only concern ourselves with the fact that her alleged discovery drew the Christians in countless thousands to the Holy Land. And Helena and her son, when they returned to the west, were laden with precious souvenirs, water from the river Jordan, soil from Golgotha, and Gethsemane, to say nothing of the nails and splinters of wood, which they thought they had taken from the true cross. These people were still saturated with the mystic spirit of relic worship, and we cannot be surprised that they attached so much importance to the value of religious objects, directly or indirectly associated with the life and death of Christ. There was nothing more intensely real in their lives than his descent into the flesh, nothing more tragic than his death on the cross. And their knowledge of him was not based on the teachings of others, for he had revealed himself to them through the mystic powers, which are the only means of direct intercourse with the divine. Before Constantine returned to the West, he relaxed the harsh laws against the Jews and established, as far as he was able, the same conditions of liberty in Palestine, which marked his reign in other parts of the Roman Empire. Their triumphant return to Rome gave rise to vast celebrations and unheard of rejoicings. Between 326 and 329 AD, Helena passed away. Her son had her body brought to Constantinople and passionately revered her memory until, in 337 AD, he too crossed the borders of that realm, which to him, as to her, had never been a shadowland.